on this day, the 20th of November, 1845. The Battle of Vuelta de Obligado took place in the Paraná River and the Rio de la Plata in Argentina, then called the Argentine Confederation. On the one side were the Argentines under the leadership of Juan Manuel de Rosas, a particularly vicious tyrant who used massive state terror to enforce his rule. Sounds like a very nice man. And on the other side were British and the French, and they were trying to enforce open trade upon the rivers. At this time in South America, things were very unsettled outside of Brazil. Brazil was the most stable country in Latin America. Most of the other countries were still in states of chaos, war, borders hadn't been delineated yet. Various countries weren't recognized. Some countries seemed to be on the way to becoming countries, but then were absorbed by others. It was a mess. Argentina, or the Argentine Confederation at the time, was no exception. In Argentina there were various groups, the Federalists and the Unitarists. The Unitarists wanted a centralized government, and the Federalists obviously didn't want that. And they spent decades beating the living hell out of each other and warring against each other. Now this Juan Manuel de Rosas, he wanted to extend the federation to include Paraguay and Uruguay. So he wanted to expand the confederation. He called it a confederation, but he was a pretty brutal dictator that was very unpopular amongst many of his countrymen. So the British and French wanted to continue trade with Paraguay, Uruguay, as well as Argentina and the various provinces of the Confederation. And Juan Manuel de Rosas and his government stipulated that every foreign merchant had to go through the customs house at Buenos Aires. Well, the British and the French were saying, well, hang on, Paraguay and Uruguay are different countries, and you're a confederation, so we shouldn't have to do that. But he enforced this. At some time, in 1838, the French blockaded the Argentine ports because they were saying this is not on. They also wanted to support Uruguayan independence, as did Brazil, and Brazil and Argentina went to war at some point. Paraguay as well wanted to remain independent, but he wanted to absorb them. So throughout the 1830s and 40s, he had major problems with the European powers. But this time, 1845, this was the culmination of all of these problems with the foreign powers. In 1845, de Rosas declared all Argentine rivers were closed to foreign shipping. The French and the British decided to send 11 vessels, along with a merchant fleet, to sail up the Paraná River towards Paraguay and Uruguay, and to defy his closing of the rivers. The French and the British had steam-powered vessels, some of the most advanced weaponry at the time, and de Rosas had very little. But what he did was he put a chain across the river. So he had a few of his own boats, and they had a chain to stop the boats going in, and they had cannon on shore, the various batteries. So their plan was to batter the ships as much as possible, prevent them from entering the river, and then they would win. unfortunately for him, his plan didn't come to fruition. The French and the British were able to sink many of his vessels, which were much smaller and not as advanced. The French were able to pass through the chain after sinking a few of the ships and landing on the shore and capturing some of the batteries. Eventually, they were able to sail up the river. There was some other skirmishes along the way, but they did make their point. However, both the British and the French had incurred a lot of damage to their ships, and so it was decided that instead of forcing this, they were going to accept the Argentine claim on the rivers. Now, eventually, it turned out to be a negotiating ploy in many ways. This is how negotiations were done in the 1840s, I suppose. So, Argentines became very friendly with the British afterwards, to the point where de Rosas, when he was overthrown, ended up going to Plymouth and then retiring to be a tenant farmer outside Southampton. So there wasn't really that sort of enmity. This was high-stakes bargaining. But once he had the recognition from the European powers that the rivers were his, they were later able to sail up them as long as they paid their dues. As I said, after this, Brazil then went to war with Argentina to ensure that Uruguay remained independent, and de Rosas obviously didn't last very long, ended up being a farmer outside Southampton. So the Anglo-French victory didn't achieve what they set out to achieve. The damage to their naval forces and the loss of the merchantmen meant that it would be too costly to sail up the Argentine rivers without their consent. It had a great impact on South America as well. Chile and Brazil decided to support the Confederation at that time. And even some of the Unitarian leaders, his enemies, they looked at him and thought, oh, he's standing up to these European powers. And some generals even offered to join his army. The British and the French eventually lifted the blockade and ended their attempts to bypass Buenos Aires. And they acknowledged the Argentines' legal right over the rivers. And then in the French, though, because they had won a great victory at Obligado, they named one of their metro stations Obligado until 1947, when they renamed it Argentine. It's a goodwill gesture after the visit of Eva Perón. So, on this day, 20th of November, 1845, the Battle of Vuelta de Obligado was fought and won, but also kind of lost. If you like these videos, come back for more. Subscribe, comment, and like.